Good evening, everyone. Foundation for Creative Social Research and Knowledge and Practice Group welcome you this evening for a virtual talk titled Dialogue on Consciousness, Marking the Contours of a Problem. The talk would be an attempt to reflect on the ontological questions of consciousness and God. It possessed a non-dualist framework to comprehend the puzzling nature of the aforementioned questions. It would also be an attempt to explore some of the implications of this non-dualist formulations, the questions that form the central truth in the discipline of philosophy of mind and philosophy of religion would be revisited by the talk to grasp not just the intricacies of the debate, but also its religio-ethical, political and ecological implications. Good evening, everyone. Foundation for Creative Social Research and Knowledge and Practice Group welcome you this evening for a virtual talk titled Dialogue on Consciousness, Marking the Contours of a Problem. The talk would be an attempt to reflect on the ontological questions of consciousness and God. It possessed a non-dualist framework to comprehend the puzzling nature of the aforementioned questions. It would also be an attempt to explore some of the implications of this non-dualist formulations, the questions that form the central truth in the discipline of philosophy of mind and philosophy of religion would be revisited by the talk to grasp not just the intricacies of the debate, but also its religio-ethical, political and ecological implications. I'll now introduce the foundation as well as our group. Foundation for Creative Social Research sets to create a discursive space for interaction among academics, writers, artists, poets, social activists, and policy makers. It intends to fill up the gap between the intellectuals and common people in the society. For this purpose, the Foundation initiates a series of dialogues on various issues of contemporary relevance and among people from different walks of life. Through these dialogues, the Foundation aims at influencing the process of knowledge production and dissemination. It emphasizes the need of shifting the terms of knowledge discourse by questioning all the established universals. It argues for accepting the emergentistic nature of knowledge so that experiences of different times and spaces could be accommodated in the construction of ever-evolving universals. The Knowledge and Practice Group was established in 2003 with the objective to create a blueprint of the text and practices specific to various traditions and societies. There has been a continued engagement between the members of the group and varied practicing communities of respective knowledge traditions across different parts of India, including Nyaya and Mimamsa tradition of Mithila, Tantric tradition of Mayang, Assam, Sufi traditions located on the Silk Route between Afghanistan and India, and the tradition of 5 saints in the Buxar region in the form of Panch Kosi Mela and Navyanay tradition of Bengal. Our speaker for this session is Varun Nigmal, who is a PhD student at Center for Political Studies, School of Social Sciences, JNU. His area of philosophical and research interests include political philosophy, philosophy of mind, with special interest in consciousness studies, philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, and politics. He is currently working on non-duality as it manifests in politics and in philosophy in Sikhism. Our chair for the session is Dr. SAURABH TODARIYA. He has completed his PhD from Center for Philosophy, JNU. He is currently Faculty of Philosophy at the School of Liberal Arts, BENNETT University, Greater Noida. He is also associated with the School of Humanities, National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore, as an adjunct faculty. His area of interest is phenomenology and philosophy of mind. He has published in various national and international journals like JICPR, Springer, EPW, Journal of Dharma Studies, South Asian History and Culture. I'll now introduce the discussants for the session. Our discussant for this evening is Dr. Nitin Nagaraj. He He has a bachelor's degree in electrical and electronics engineering from National Institute of Technology, Karnataka, master's degree in electrical engineering from Renaissance Polytechnic Institute, Troy, New York, USA, and PhD from National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. He has previously held positions at GE Global Research, ISAR Pune, and Amrita University. He is currently Associate Professor, National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. His research area include complexity theories of consciousness, brain-inspired machine learning. He has co-authored 30 international journal publications with 1,200 plus citations, over 50 plus national and international conference paper presentation, and is the co-inventor of 8 US patent applications, of which 2 are granted. He is a co-editor of the edited volume Self, Culture, and Consciousness, Interdisciplinary Convergences on Knowing and Being, Springer. He is a senior member of the IEEE and an invited member of the Advisory Council of METI, that is Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence International, USA. Our second discussant for this session is Dr. Shraddha Shah. Started teaching philosophy in 2017 onwards at Hindu College, University of Delhi. She has graduated from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University, and was conferred her doctorate degree in 2018 by Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi, for her thesis titled The Concept of Labor, a Semiological Analysis. Her research interest focused on metaphysics, epistemology, and social and political philosophy, and the interrelation of these areas. Our third discussion for the session is Swami Shama Chaitanya. He's a monk pursuing his spiritual calling in Rishikesh. He was a student of Hindu College, Delhi University, and started his professional career as a lecturer at the Delhi University of Arts and Commerce in the early 1990s. He switched several jobs and later worked with the World Bank for a decade. Dissatisfied, he called it a day and moved to Rishikesh to study Vedanta and other scriptures with traditional acharyas. He spends his time studying, teaching, traveling, and counseling people in distress. Our last but definitely not the least discussant of the day is RASHI SOAM. She's a master's student of political studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her interests are the pursuit of questions regarding reality, being and becoming, and the possibilities for conscious living, and which brings her to the discussion for today. Thank you everybody for joining for this session. Before we start, just a gentle reminder to accept the speaker. Please keep your audio on the mute form. And now I'll give the floor to the chair. Thank you.
Enigma for not just analytic philosophers and cognitive scientists, but also for social scientists. So I am trying to bridge the gap, the epistemic gap that exists between analytic philosophy and social sciences or continental philosophy. So let me start with my first part, which is basically mapping the ontology of consciousness and God. As I've already mentioned, that consciousness is a mystery. To know your own subjective experience has been a puzzle since antiquity. Both the philosophers as well as saints and sages have trying to sort of understand the mystery of it, but nobody has reached a conclusion. Like if you would ask anyone that is there any one definition of this term called consciousness, if you would ask a neuroscientist, he would give his own understanding. If you would ask a sage, he would explain it differently with a different method. If you would ask a social scientist, he would explain it differently. So there is no consensus regarding the not just the definition, but the understanding of the concept itself. Secondly, I would say that the concept of God is equally perplexing. If you would ask a believer what is God, he might be able to sort of explain that, okay, God is, for me, God is this, who listens to my prayer, who is disembodied in nature, who is transcendental, who exists in transcendental domain. Or sometimes he might also say that God lies within us, which is basically the immanent conception of God. But still, regarding as consciousness, God, the concept of God is equally perplexing, and there is no consensus regarding not just the definition but the understanding. And I feel that both the concept of consciousness and God are entangled, and they need to be, this enigma, this puzzle needs to be addressed in a fashion where they are seen as one rather than as seen as disintegrated concepts. as I've mentioned that these two concepts should rather be seen as integrated whole rather than being seen as disintegrated, differentiated concepts. So I'll start with first with mapping the very debate, the ontology of it, like the mapping the ontology of consciousness and God. So I'll start with consciousness. See, as I've mentioned, consciousness is a mystery. It's a puzzle that is very well known for now. There have been many understandings concerning consciousness, especially in philosophy of mind. For instance, there is this prominent understanding called functionalism, method called functionalism. Functionalism is basically nothing but a philosophical position that argues that consciousness has a functional role to play, and there are mental states that can be emulated, imitated in something else rather than just brain. So in this functionalist framework and discourse, a silicon-based body, a silicon-based robot or any entity can be conscious, because until or unless the body or the robot is performing its functional role that thoughts perform. So consciousness has been traditionally looked at from the functionalist perspective. And recently, what has changed in this very discourse of consciousness in philosophy of mind is that earlier, like within functionalist framework, philosophers or scientists were at least ready to acknowledge that consciousness or qualia, which is basically the subjective experience, they were at least ready to acknowledge that it actually exists. It might have a functional role, but it still exists. But what has changed right now, especially in some of the neuroscientific circles, and some philosophers like Daniel Dennett and Patricia and Paul Churchland, they have started arguing that there is nothing called qualia. Qualia is like a remnant of folk psychology, which actually doesn't exist at all. So all the intricacies of the behavior that can be explained by consciousness can be explained through understanding of the brain states. So it's a reductionism of the highest order, I would say. And it's basically not explaining consciousness, but explaining away consciousness. For instance, Daniel Dennett has written a book called Consciousness Explained, who is a supporter of eliminativism, this paradigm called eliminativism. But I would rather say that Daniel Dennett has not explained consciousness by saying that qualia. He has explained the very idea of consciousness. He has explained away, like he has completely he has taken the baby out with the bathwater. He is right now saying that there is nothing called mental or inner subjective experience. Mental states are just an epiphenomenal states, or not just epiphenomenal, but they are illusions. And in the long run, we would be able to explain the nuances and intricacies of not just our behavior, but our inner subjective feeling through complex brain mechanism. And scholars like Churchland are affirming that. In fact, Churchland is the one who started talking in those ideas. But before Churchland, it is very important to mention that before Churchland, continental philosophers like Richard Rorty and even philosopher of science like Paul Feyerabend has argued for such positions. And they have not called it eliminativism, rather they have called it the disappearance theory of mind, that mind does not exist. And the mind, mind is in a remnant of folk psychology, and it shouldn't be seen as something which is mysterious, as is seen by so many Mysterian philosophers like Colin McGinn and even Steven Pinker. So they have argued that there is no reasoning to explain, to get sort of obsessed or to stick to this qualia thing, because it can be easily explained. But I'm taking this position that they are not explaining it, they are explaining it away. So they are basically taking the baby out with the bathwater. They are trying to get rid of this very phenomena itself. So this is what eliminativism is, and this is what functionalism is. These two are very important positions in philosophy of mind, taken seriously, but both are equally problematic in my understanding. And apart from functionalism and eliminativism, there is a very interesting position which is worth mentioning, and that position is emergentism. So emergentism is nothing but is a position that argues that consciousness is an emergent phenomena. It emerges after a certain level of complexity or a certain level of complex computations that happens in the brain, and it can be explained as an emergentist phenomena and an epiphenomenal stuff. It's an epiphenomenal stuff, and this emergentist position has been taken seriously, not just in philosophy of mind, but in various other continental traditions. For instance, philosopher like Roy Bhaskar has taken this position in his earlier framework, especially in critical realism, not in the later framework, where I feel that he's more close to panpsychism. His meta-realism is more close to panpsychism, but his earlier philosophical propositions is close to this emergentist framework, where it's an epiphenomenal stuff which arises or emerges after a certain level of complexity has been achieved. I would say that emergentism is a better position, but still there are many problems. First of all, there are problems of reconciling emergentism with evolutionary theory. Because in my understanding, consciousness, in whatever fashion, in whatever amount, if it exists, it has to be there since inception. Like it has been argued that consciousness, in however fashion, if it exists, is an illegitimate child if you're not including consciousness at the ground level. So my position is that consciousness in some form, whether it is in micro form or it is in complex form, must exist or exist at the fundamental nature of the universe. And evolutionaries, there are no abrupt changes in nature, and it's a gradual process. Evolution. So in my understanding, panpsychism, which is basically this idea that universe or nature is suffused with consciousness, whether as constituent elements in terms of the particles of constituent elements, or whether universe in the larger whole is conscious, is compatible with evolutionary logic. As on the other hand, emergentism in my framework is not that compatible with emergentist logic. And panpsychism, because of parsimony, because of its parsimonious explanation, I feel is a better position in the philosophy of mind in explaining consciousness. And after giving this brief after explaining briefly the larger sort of context of the sort of debates that exist within consciousness, I would now argue that why panpsychism is a better position in philosophy of mind, and it should be taken seriously. First of all, panpsychism is not just a philosophical position on consciousness. It has in philosophy of mind, it is now gaining a lot of credence and traction within neuroscience. So for that, let me mention a very interesting recent theory, not that old. It was formulated in 2004 by a neuroscientist named Giulio Tononi and his colleagues. That is called integrated information theory. Now, what is so unique about integrated information theory on consciousness that makes it different from other conventional theories of neuroscientific theories on consciousness, like global workspace and others, is that it starts with phenomenological experience. It starts with consciousness, and it assumes consciousness as information that is not just intrinsic, but also causal in relation. So it sort of unifies subjectivity with causality. And it starts with experience and then look for physical systems, and then sort of postulates physical systems that can sort of be reconciled with the conscious experience. And it has a lot of empirical evidence now. And for instance, I should mention a very prominent neuroscientist, contemporary neuroscientist, Christoph Koch, who was a hardcore materialist, reductionist. In fact, he has written a book earlier that's called The Confession of a Romantic Reductionist. Is now turning into a sort of a proponent of panpsychism because he's supporting integrated information theory, and has now come up with works like his contemporary work. It talks about the feeling of, the title is very interesting. It talks about, it's like this, that feeling of life itself, why consciousness is widespread but can't be computed. So he has shifted from a materialist, reductionist materialist, to a proponent of integrated information theory that is very close, which is very close to some kind of panpsychism, especially micropsychism. So that is why, in my understanding, panpsychism, which is non-dualist, I mean, there has been objections, there has been criticism of panpsychism from someone like Donald Hoffman, who has called panpsychism to be dualist, because panpsychism is, according to him, cannot be non-dualist, because if you are saying that matter entails mind, definitely these two, matter and mind, must be ontologically separate. But that is not the case, because panpsychism is not arguing that matter and mind are separate, but in fact it's arguing that they exist in an entangled relationship. And that is what people like philosophers like Galen Strawson and Chalmers and contemporary philosopher who is leading the resurgence of panpsychism, Philip Goff, is arguing, that it's a non-dual framework and should be taken seriously because of its parsimony and its logical consistency, as well as because of its empirical ground. It's been empirically tested in neuroscientific circles. So that is all about the larger context of consciousness, why I feel that this non-dualist panpsychist framework is a very, very fruitful and productive framework to understand consciousness, as compared to other frameworks like eliminativism, functionalism, or emergentism, as well as reductionistic materialism. Now, I would come to this position, this concept of God, and as I've already mentioned, that I'm not seeing, these two concepts as disgruntled, disjointed, disintegrated concept. Rather, I'm trying to argue that these concepts have some close connection, because consciousness, as we mentioned, is about subjective experience. We cannot think anything apart from consciousness in the same way, and it's a mystery. In the same way, and there is no consensus regarding the understanding and definition, in the same way, the concept of God is equally perplexing. For instance, earlier we have this conception of God, not earlier, I mean, this has been there, but this conception of God has been there, that God is something which is disembodied, which is transcendental, which exists in other domain, and then that God listens to our prayers. And we need that God because it provides us with the survival, it has survival functional role. But I feel that this concept of God can be challenged. And why, first of all, this concept of God is problematic? Because it goes well with the power dynamics, the kind of power structure that is there. And it has been argued by many philosophers of religion, like Mary Rubinstein and others, that this concept of God is not just disembodied, transcendental, which further sort of accentuates the power structure, but it is highly patriarchal. It is highly hierarchical. It creates unnecessary divide between human and nature, and between humans and humans. So the position that I'm trying to sort of espouse in my non-dual philosophical framework concerning the nature of God is the position called pantheism, or panentheism. Though pantheism and panentheism are different, I'll explain what is the difference, but both are equally plausible. But right now in this paper, I'm taking pantheistic position, and I'm trying to argue that pantheistic position does exist in an enmeshed relationship with panpsychism. Although these two concepts, panpsychism and pantheism, are not one concept, and they are different concepts. One is the plausible position in philosophy of mind, other is the position in philosophy of religion. But I'm trying to argue that pantheism entails panpsychism, because if God is nature, and nature is God, and God is universe, and if it is without sentience, then it is inert and brute, and then it doesn't make any sense. So pantheism, in my understanding, entails panpsychism, because it provides provides this argument not just for the ubiquity of God, but ubiquity of sentience, and God and sentience is one. With a caveat that this sentience and this conception of God that I'm trying to propose is not the anthropocentric conception. I'm not trying to argue that consciousness, which is all pervasive, as is the case with panpsychism, or cosmopsychism, which is the cosmological version of panpsychism, it's human consciousness. No, I'm not making this position. I'm trying to argue that it is the experience that is fundamental. And consciousness, which is human consciousness, or from where self-reflexivity comes, which is at the higher order, is a product of that experience. It's an actuality. It's a possibility embedded in the structures of the universe that gets actualized, that has got actualized with the evolutionary advancement of human species and universe. So I'm trying to argue that it is not the consciousness of human-centric consciousness. So it's not anthropomorphism, or it's not anthropocentric doctrine. In fact, I'm trying to argue that the excluding consciousness from universe is anthropocentric, because then you are making this position that consciousness is so idiosyncratic, that is, it is just unique to humans. And I'm trying to argue that consciousness, like space, time, like gravity, is like a field which is all pervasive, and our consciousness could be a part of that larger field. And when I say consciousness, I actually don't mean self or subject. People try to sort of equate self with consciousness or subject. I'm saying self is another concept, consciousness is another. Consciousness is fundamentally about experience, and through the complexity of experience, we get self. So I am trying to basically give a solution to the very famous problem in philosophy of mind called the hard problem of consciousness, which is basically that why are we not zombies? Why in the first place we have evolved this inner subjective experience? For instance, David Chalmers, a very prominent philosopher in the philosophy of mind circles, have framed this fundamental problem called heart problem, that according to him, there are two problems of consciousness. One is the easy problem, which is basically the problem of memory, cognition, thinking, perception, which could be argued through the conventional neuroscientific processes, brain processes and mechanisms. But there is something called the heart problem, which is the problem of why we have the inner subjective feeling in the first place, which is called qualia. According to him, we could have evolved as zombies. We could have performed our function of disseminating our genes and propagation of our genes without any inner subjective experience. So according to him, consciousness in any form, whether minute or in complex, is in any philosophy without consciousness cannot be a very analytically coherent philosophy. Consciousness has to be grounded in as the fundamental feature of the universe. So I'm trying to look at the solutions to the hard problem of consciousness and trying to sort of argue that panpsychism, whether micropsychism, which is that entities at the basic level are conscious, or proto-conscious, that is, they have the possibility and their possibility gets actualized, or universe as a whole, cosmos as a whole is conscious, and we are components of that consciousness, and that consciousness as a whole is like a field. So this is about the ontology of the debate surrounding the ontology of consciousness and God. Now, I will try to sort of compare this non-dualist panpsychist position with another two very important philosophical positions in philosophy of mind, and both, in analytic philosophy of mind as well as continental philosophy, which is the radical embodied phenomenology and analytic idealism. First, I will go into radical embodied phenomenology. What is radical phenomenology, radical embodied phenomenology? Radical embodied phenomenology has been framed by, it's not a term that is framed by a philosopher named Merleau-Ponty, but it has been attributed to Ponty by a philosopher named Michel Bidball. So radical phenomenology starts with this assumption that consciousness is basically about lived experience. The problem of consciousness is basically about lived experience. And it formulates this position that lived experience is primary, and any deliberation of consciousness on consciousness from outside consciousness is very problematic, because then you are basically indulging in an objectification of consciousness. So according to radical phenomenology, what panpsychism is doing is basically trying to sort of use a very scientific, objectivist method to understand something which is extremely subjective, to understand something which is part of you, which is part of the world, which is actually world from an outsider's perspective. So for instance, it has been argued that by the proponents of radical phenomenology, that what panpsychism does is that it takes the cosmic order of reason and science for granted, and then tries to put another component into it, the component of qualia from the outside, and then tries to sort of solve this hard problem of consciousness. And that is where the problem lies, because any consciousness is not something which can be objectified. because any objectification, the process of objectification, can only be done through consciousness. So this is what the framework of radical embodied phenomenology espouse. And it is linked with this very interesting or very popular framework right now in the cognitive science, which is called the embodied cognition. And then there is this term called 4E cognition, which is embodied, embedded, extended, and inactive. And this framework is propounded by another phenomenologist, Ivan Thompson. My problem with this framework, because I'm trying to look at from a panpsychist position, I'm espousing a panpsychist position. My problem with this framework is that this framework gives primacy to epistemology over metaphysics, and it ignores the very origin of this consciousness. It ignores the question of that why consciousness exists in the first place. Phenomenology, despite its deep insights and profound insights, cannot explain why consciousness exists in the first place. The very problem of metaphysics. It tries to do away with metaphysics. And I'm trying to postulate that neurophenomenology, which is another version of radical phenomenology propounded by a very interesting neuroscientist, Francisco Varela, or radical phenomenology. Neurophenomenology is nothing basically, it's basically a kind of a combination of neurocognitive processes, trying to draw a correlation between neurocognitive processes and phenomenological experience. It was formulated by philosopher and neuroscientist Francisco Varela in 1980s, which was taken by Ivan Thompson later. Neurophenomenology or radical phenomenology cannot, they are basically what they are doing, what the proponents of these traditions are doing is that they are trying to completely evade the question of ontology and metaphysics. And they are saying that epistemic concerns, epistemological concerns, that is, how do we know what reality is primary, rather than what is the question of reality, what is reality, which is ontological question, as taking that question as primary. So I am proposing that panpsychism or pan-qualitism, another form of panpsychism, can be a metaphysical counterpart to phenomenology. So I'm trying to make this position that you don't have to take these two positions, phenomenology, radical embodied phenomenology, and panpsychism in an antithetical fashion. There can be some collaboration of these two traditions, because phenomenology needs a metaphysical ground, which they try to sort of say that metaphysical questions are not important. But my position is that even if you're not taking a metaphysical point, epistemological position, you are implicitly, tacitly accepting a metaphysical position. For instance, in my understanding, radical embodied phenomenology is physicalist, is materialist in framework. It tries to give body, it tries to reduce things to bodily experience in my framework, in my understanding. And then there are idealist phenomenological traditions from the likes of Edmund Husserl and others. So my position is that pan-qualitism, which is a form of panpsychism, which is a critical metaphysical position that can be seen as compatible to radical embodied phenomenology, and is a critical metaphysical counterpart to phenomenological insights and epistemological insights. So I'm not completely outrightly rejecting radical insights of radical embodied phenomenology. Secondly, I'm trying to compare this non-dualist panpsychist framework with another very interesting non-dualist philosophical position called analytical idealism. And it is gaining a lot of traction recently in I don't know how much traction it's sort of gaining in the philosophical circle, but it has become very popular in some other circles, some other academic circles. And there are lots of interesting dialogues on analytical idealism, revived by a very interesting philosopher come computer scientist named Bernardo Kastrop. So Kastrop's position is that one should not see consciousness the way panpsychists are seeing, because according to Kastrop, panpsychists are arguing that everything has consciousness. Everything entails consciousness, every physical reality or matter entails consciousness. This position is wrong according to him. Rather than everything is conscious, and material reality is a reflection. It's a reflection of that fundamental consciousness. Now, the problem that arises for Kastrop is how shall we explain our individual experiences, individual dissociated experiences? For that, he gives an interesting analogy. He gives this analogy of this very interesting psychiatric disorder called dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder. So what happens with multiple personality and dissociative identity disorder is that the same person, it's the same person with the same body tends to have multiple personalities. So Kastrop is using that psychiatric disorder and trying to argue that there is cosmic consciousness and we are the manifestation and reflection. Everything is a reflection of that, every material entity. And our individual experiences, our individual self is the dissociative alter of that whole cosmic consciousness. And when we die, that dissociative alters also dies. So there is this process called dissociation that happens with the advent, with our birth. And then in the meantime, we live our life, we have our lived experience, and then we die. There is this thing called dissolution of consciousness that happens. And this dissolution of consciousness is with the dissolution of consciousness, there is this merger of a dissociative alter with the cosmic self, cosmic consciousness. And he gives this analogy of whirlpool, this waves in the sea that tends to get produced, and then they eventually get merged with consciousness, with the sea. And this tradition is very close to Indic philosophical tradition, especially Advaita Vedanta. My position is, for instance, I should mention that recent insights in this field of psychedelics, which are basically, hallucination producing drugs, are also sort of, in a way, I won't say substantiating, but trying to sort of provide us with insights that goes well with analytic idealism. For instance, what happens when somebody takes a psychedelic drug, for instance, acid, LSD or DMT, he loses a sense of self. And there is oneness with the universal entity, oneness with your external reality. According to Kastrop, similar thing happens with the process of dying, where we lose our sense of self and we have a sense of unity with the cosmic consciousness. And that is a very fearful experience according to Kastrop. But the unity is blissful. And according to him, the worst is basically the coming back to the dissociative alter state. So this is very analogous. This is very close.
Varun,
yeah.
Last 5 minutes and you can wrap up.
Okay. So this is very close to Indic philosophies and Indic ideas of reincarnation. So my problem with analytic idealism is that it sort of tries to blur it. It is vague when it comes to this divide between life and consciousness, life and mind. It blurs life with mind, and it is not able to explain why some entities like humans and other animals, sentient creatures, have life while others don't. So it creates unnecessary gap or gulf between matter that is animate and that is inanimate, or that is live and that is not living. So it's vague in some sense, and it lacks empirical evidence. Panpsychism has problems, but it is more fruitful when it comes to its empirical credentials. It is grounded in a non-dualist framework, and it is more parsimonious. Because of the paucity of time, I'll come back. I might visit this problem again with the question and answer session. But I should right now go back to my third idea, which is third component of this paper, which is the implication of this framework, this non-dualist philosophical framework, panpsychist and pantheistic. My position is, my understanding is that panpsychism is now being taken seriously in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, and pantheism is now being taken seriously in philosophy of religion, which it earlier wasn't taken that seriously, has huge implications when it comes to issues pertaining to religion and ethics, and also politics and ecology. Why? Because first of all, let me try with this formulation. Let me start with this formulation. Because panpsychism is an ontological position, and ontological positions are not seen as political positions. Political philosophy has completely sort of dissociated itself with the ontological and metaphysical questions. But there lies the problem of political philosophy. My position is that ontological questions are inherently political in nature. Because if you don't know what the reality is and what it constituted of, then how can you do politics? How can you have ethical concerns about things? For instance, indigenous societies or tribal societies trying to argue that river is alive. So they have an ontological position on river. This is an ontological position that they have. And first of all, let me tell you this, that animism, which is very prominent in tribal and indigenous societies, is nothing but panpsychism in action. So if you don't take their ontological position seriously, how can you have a political lens towards them? So my point is that panpsychism should be seen not just as an apolitical position or as a position which is devoid of any spiritual connotation or spiritual implication or ecological implication, but rather it is deeply enmeshed with questions pertaining to ecology, especially ecology like deep ecology. For instance, deep ecology is nothing but a position where nature is seen as suffused with value. Akil Bilgrami, in his very important work, Supernatural and Naturalism and Nature and Value, has argued that our roots of our ecological crisis lies in a certain understanding of God and religion. And he's basically repeating this very famous work by Lyon White, The Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, where this idea of banished God, this idea of God which is there in the transcendental domain, which started with a certain kind of Protestant Christianity, is the root of our ecological and political crisis. Because pantheism has democratic potential. If you start associating value to nature and value to universe, then, and without creating unnecessary hierarchy between entities and between animate and inanimate nature, then you are basically arguing for a flat ontology, which is democratic in nature. So as Bilgrami has pointed out that pantheism had political potentials, I am also trying to sort of repeat his position that pantheistic position has a lot of political potential, as well as, and panpsychist position, I mean, trying to argue that pantheism and panpsychism are entangled. So both these positions have a lot of political potentials and possibilities, as well as ethical potential and deep spiritual as well as ecological potential. And I mean, I'll just end with the spiritual, how it is spiritual, because how do we see spirituality? First of all, we tend to have a two understanding of spirituality. One is the functionalist understanding, and second is we sense to have a understanding of spirituality where we try to argue that there is the concept of reality, there is a matter of reality which is enigmatic, and all the spiritual traditions in a way trying to sort of understand that enigmatic reality. And in my understanding, consciousness is that frame which is enigmatic, and all the spiritual traditions are basically, in some sense or the other, is trying to understand this enigmatic position. So that is why I'm trying to argue that panpsychism is enmeshed with spiritual concerns, political concerns, ethical concerns, and it has a lot of resonance with neuroscientific insights and also quantum insights. I mean, because of paucity of time, I cannot speak more on the quantum aspect of it, but there has been close association between consciousness and quantum mechanics. Both are mysterious, and people like Alexander Wendt have written extensively on it. I can sort of delve into it if somebody is interested in it. So with that, I'll end my talk. Thank you so much for providing me this opportunity. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Varun. It's really a thought-provoking presentation, and I feel the gamut is very wide because you covered philosophy of mind, fundamental questions of the foundational question of philosophy regarding consciousness, and taking it to the theology, ecology, and to the issues of the social, politics also. So this is really, I'm sure that it has provoked a lot of questions, and of course it's provoked in me also. So with this, I invite our discussant today, and our first discussant for the today session is Dr. Shraddha Shah. So I invite Dr. Shraddha Shah, please.
Hi, Varun.
Hi.
Good evening to everyone else here. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. This was obviously a very thought-provoking paper, and I think I'm perhaps going to hold a somewhat distinctive position in terms of this discussion, because I would actually, the first question that I would like to raise to you, Varun, is why is consciousness the issue for a non-dualist? And to substantiate my question and sort of the beginning of this discussion, I sort of want to go back to the classics, and I want to go back to the fundamentals actually of dualism itself. For instance, when, and the best person to do that, I mean, to do this is to look at Descartes. Now, when you look at Descartes, the distinction that he makes between an unextended conscious or mind and the extended thing, which is the body, or the world of matter, is where we, mark the beginning of dualism in the modern world, right? In the modern philosophical discourse. And this distinction between the mind and the body / world is what then comes to, mark out the discourse for all subsequent, discussions around what the world of consciousness is, what the world of matter is, likewise, for a certain non-dualistic approach as well. However, I would like to go back to what Descartes' fundamental problem was, which was, what is the relationship between mind and body? Okay, I mean, when it's a fairly basic sort of issue, that if mind is something which is completely constituted, or consciousness, if you so like, is constituted of these completely different characteristics, and body is something which is also, of a completely different constitutive characteristics, how do the two interact? And therefore, Descartes tries to posit the pineal gland, and he's been lambasted for it through the history of Western thought, right? Where no one's accepted that. But what tends to happen is that this key issue of the relationship between mind and the body is what constitutes the problem of non-dualism. Now, the trajectories that tend to follow dualism are, one, reductionism, which is what you instantiated in your discussions of consciousness, where eliminativism, functionalism, etc., tend to demonstrate that sort of perspective. The other is, where subjectivity or consciousness becomes the first foreground, right? Where you start out your discussion with consciousness. And I would posit that that's another sort of reductionism. One sort of is to reduce everything to materiality. The other one is to reduce everything to consciousness. And when you seek a position of non-dualism, what you're seeking for is sides where, a relationship between mind and matter, or between the conscious and so-called unconscious, can actually be uncovered. And for that, the beginning point then is the body. All right. This is precisely the reason that I would first like to visit your thesis on embodied phenomenology. Now, I really haven't looked at the work of Mitchell Bidpol, who you have cited extensively in your paper, and you were also discussing when you were discussing radical phenomenology. Now, when you look at someone like Merleau-Ponty, his position is not devoid of metaphysics. In fact, or for that matter, even ontology, he begins with ontology, because his question is not embodied cognition. That's perhaps a later attribution or a later formulation to Merleau-Ponty. What he begins with is the body. What exactly is the ontology of the body? And in response to Cartesian dualism, he posits that the body is who we are, right? And therefore, what he's trying to say is that the body is not purely material in nature. It is something which is inherently imbued with consciousness. Okay. Now, if I am to explain this in terms of the Cartesian dualist framework, Descartes' problem is the phantom limb pain, right? Where he starts out by saying that, look, because you experience phantom limb pain, therefore the body can give you dubitable knowledge. There obviously is nothing material there, which then allows you to feel pain. And therefore, the body is something which misguides you. It's something which doesn't really, appeal to this idea of certainty and the kind of knowledge that he has in mind with regards to the modern vocabulary. And the point here is that in this sort of discourse, you can already see the relationship between epistemology and metaphysics / ontology. That how is it that the body comes to be formulated? So the question is not that whether the body is, material or not. The point is what allows for the body to be regarded as material. And that is a dualistic analysis of the body. Now, when we look at someone like Merleau-Ponty, he's starting out with the idea that we are the body. And when he speaks of the body, he doesn't mean it in a biological sense. He very categorically dismisses that idea. He starts with this idea that a body or, our location in that sense is what allows us perspective onto the world. And therefore, again, the question is not that whether it's a subjective experience or an objective experience. The point is that all experience is subjective as well as objective. And you therefore cannot bypass that, which is what is essentially the problem with dualism. So the point that I'm trying to make is that every time, when we engage in this discourse of consciousness and when we're looking at sort of these discussions, what we need to recover, especially as non-dualists, and I am fairly sympathetic to your general concern of how non-dualism sort of allows you to relook at politics, relook at ethics, and perhaps, all the other things which are sort of seen as disconnected. Yes, that's a very important concern, but I'm not sure how that works out with regards to, panpsychism. So one is that I would perhaps like more details on that. And two, my more fundamental question is that as a non-dualist, our point of analysis should be with sites that begin with showing this inherent intricate connection between consciousness and mind. Because the whole point is, how do we approach consciousness? How do we get past it? If we begin with consciousness, yes, this whole problem of subjectivity, of first-person experience, of trying to articulate what it is. Now, even in your position of panpsychism, where you say that matter and mind are, sort of intricate and constantly sort of tied up with one another. When you look at, I've read your paper. This is not something that you've discussed in this talk, but I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to the classics. I'm going to go back to the discussion between Spinoza and Leibniz. When you look at someone like Spinoza, you have the conception of an absolute substance, and you have mind and extension coeval with that substance, which is where you have the conception of God. Now, when you look at someone like Leibniz, you also have inherently a principle of differentiation. So, and why I'm insisting on this is because, you've referred to this issue in your paper again, the problem of combination, right? How is it that individual consciousness and individual psyches sort of come together to form part of the whole? The problem is also the other way around, which is, I think, again, something that you've referred to, of decombination, of how does the whole, differentiate into parts. And this problem is something which someone like Leibniz takes into account. Because for Leibniz, and again, I think Leibniz represents a better position for non-dualism, because there you see a relationship between the universal and the particular, which is then needed to be mediated. You see man, or, and again, I don't know if you would call this anthropocentric, but in general, when you look at any religious framework, or when you look at any traditional framework, the triad is between man, nature, and God. Okay, and in that sense, it can never just be God and nature, because what is the position of the individual person? And this sort of has implications for your study on consciousness as well, because each time we're making claims about ecology, about nature itself, we are doing it from a particular vantage point. And that vantage point is something which is important for us to mark out. Now, do we privilege that vantage point? Perhaps not, but we still need to differentiate it. Because, one of the implications that I'm sort of getting at is with regards to, again, this is something that you discussed in the paper, was someone like Gilbert Harman, who works with an object-oriented ontology. When you look at someone like Harman, the democracy with which you're speaking of, and this sort of flattened ontology, it definitely gives rise to political problems than actually solving them. So in a very abstract level, you're able to say, well, every form of being is at par with one another, right? But when you're looking at contestation, when you're looking at conflicts, when you're looking at relationships, this sort of framework will not allow you to make those, will not allow you to resolve those contestations. And this is, again, whereas a non-dualist, one has to seek a sort of relationship between the particulars and the universal in tune with marking out individual, or the consciousness of man, if you so like. So I think this sort of mediation, where we need to take account of both sides of the question, becomes very significant. And questions of signification particularly need to be accounted for. So when we're looking at, say, again, someone like Leibniz, he makes a differentiation between perceptions and apperception. So, monads are ultimately spiritual beings. All monads are, whether we're talking about plants, animals, God itself, or we're speaking of human beings, all are monads. But there are degrees of consciousness. There is a difference in terms of perception and apperception. And this is what marks out human consciousness as being significant. And therefore allows a sort of politics to emerge, which can take account of self-consciousness, perception, and yet allow, to not completely objectify nature, right? So what I'm asking for is particularly these sites of contestation. For instance, in your criticism of analytic idealism, when you were talking about Castrop right now, your precise discomfort with Castrop in terms of equating psychedelics and dying as unity with the ultimate, or whatever the particular thesis is. I don't know Castrop's thesis, I'm only going by what you just said. That discomfort is precisely where the non-dualist perspective comes in, because this idea that action, or what do we do with the world if taking psychedelics and dying is at par, and it sort of is just dissolving consciousness into the ultimate, what happens to this world? Okay, and that particular contestation.
Sorry, Shraddha ma'am, you will have to wrap up in another 2 to 3 minutes, please.
Okay, so last remarks, right?
Thank
I should have actually asked you for the time first. But anyway, so coming back to my point, that a non-dualist perspective would focus on that sort of side, action, where world is necessary for your consciousness to take effect. Now, if you were just talking about consciousness, consciousness can be anything. Consciousness is not bridled by the world. But when you have to take account of action, when you have to take account of language, you need to take account of the world as well, which is essentially where you see the relationship between mind and matter, or spirit and matter, however you would like to call it. So these are sort of my remarks. And if you want clarity, I can come back to some of these things. So I think I'm just going to wrap up for now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shraddha, for these really interesting questions. I think I would have no problem with accepting Leibniz proposition, and I'm not sure because I'm not that well versed with Leibniz, but I think I know a bit about Spinoza, and Spinoza was a dual aspect monist, as I've also mentioned in my paper, and dual aspect monism is a form of panpsychism. And I think you have raised this sort of question that most of the time has been raised by the likes of phenomenologists. And I'm not negating phenomenological insights. I'm just saying that, one can have a critical metaphysics that can accompany, that can go well with the phenomenological insights. So these concerns that you have raised are really there in existential phenomenology, are really there in some, I'm not sure, but I think it's there in Heidegger. I think it's there in other phenomenologists. But again, when it comes to origin of consciousness, when it comes to this fundamental question of why we have inner subjective experience, there I think panpsychist insights are really interesting and really important. And secondly, what I really liked about your question is that this ontology of action thing, because you have said that when you are framing a politics and when you are sort of framing it in from a flat ontology, then relationships are always embedded in a complex web of hierarchy, and then politics has to be framed differently. I would say that panpsychism gives you a ground for action also. Like, I don't think panpsychists, for instance, Alfred Whitehead is a pan-experientialist, and Alfred Whitehead is radical in his understanding of not just ecology, but also a certain understanding of polity. And his framework is processual in nature. So he's not trying to argue that there is a substance or entity, which is the Cartesian thing, which is unchangeable, which is dualistic. Experience and reality exist in a processual fashion, and it's relational. So becoming, in a way, is always the central focus and fulcrum of Whitehead's philosophy, and becoming always precedes being. So I think ontology of action that you are trying to sort of posit here, in my view, can go with this framework that I'm trying to sort of look into. So, but of course, we can have more discussion on this. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Now I invite Professor Nitin for his comments.
Yeah. Thank you, Saurav, and thanks to FCSR and Knowledge and Practice Group for inviting me. A very lucid presentation, Varun. I think And I know time is our enemy, so let me quickly I have a list of comments, and you don't have to answer all of them. You could work on it and we could always discuss offhand, but I thought, let me give you my comments. But largely, I think I'm sort of in agreement with many of your points, but I'll just, in interest of time, I'm only going to talk about things which I think can be problematic. First is, I think it's a good idea probably for you to specify the exact flavor of panpsychism that you're going to propose. Maybe it's in your thesis, it's not in the paper, because is it top down or bottom up? Is it cosmopsychism? What exact, I mean, the details would be interesting to know. And how exactly does it differ from idealism? For example, do you make the distinction between phenomenal consciousness and metacognitive consciousness? Do you make the distinction? Do you posit that the entire universe, if it's conscious, is it self-reflective or not? So these kind of details are very important. I'm pretty sure that the thesis will address that. I'm pretty sure that you would have done that, but I thought reading the paper, these were the questions I got. IIT, right, has serious problems. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of them. Just to give a few, I've just listed a few here. Scott Aronson. Scott Aronson's, he's a computer scientist from Texas A&M. So he talks about, he constructs this expander graph of XOR logical gates, which has more consciousness than a human being, using Tononi's theory, And of course, Tononi bites the bullet and he says, yeah, it is more conscious. And that creates this problem, that do we really believe that a logical network of logical units like XORs can have higher consciousness than a human being? Those kind of things. Furthermore, Tononi says that the geometry of information relationships, the cause-effect relationship between network of neurons is equal to qualia, is equal to quail. So that seems very strange, right? How could a geometrical configuration be equated to qualia? It seems very arbitrary, So this is another problem. Then all these issues, that what is the unit of analysis? Why should it be neurons? Why not quarks? Okay, all these, I mean, I'm pretty sure that you're familiar with. There's a whole bunch of problems with the IIT. Then the other question I had for you is, in panpsychism, I mean, your flavor of panpsychism, what is the status of space, time, and matter? Is it on the same level as consciousness, or is it at a low, or is it at a above? I mean, like consciousness is more fundamental, and space and time are higher. The reason that I ask is, it's pretty much clear in today's physics. You can look up Nima Arkani Ahmed, right? This famous Princeton theoretical physicist. So he talks about the doom of space-time. He talks about a purely quantum mechanical argument that space and time are not fundamental. And this is a world-class physicist saying this, and he gives reasons why they're not fundamental. He gives a set of arguments. Carl Friston's work, he uses arguments from thermodynamics. He argues how our cognitive apparatus cannot encode the states of the world in a lossless fashion. It will be lossy. So there is no way that space and time are embedded in our representation. So space and time are just, and that's where Hoffman, I think, is right. I mean, he's got that part right, that space and time are just icons. They're just useful shortcuts. So physics and biology are converging to this point that space and time are not really fundamental. There's something more fundamental. So that is one thing I wanted to mention. The other thing is, what is your take on the interrelationship between consciousness and brain? Now, this is a very tricky problem. One is, of course, the entire psychedelic thing, and there are other examples of how reduction in the metabolism in the brain leads to higher amount of conscious experience. It could be psychedelics, it could be meditation, it could be samadhi, it could be mediumship. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. There's a lot of studies on this, and it's very controversial, I know. But is consciousness independent of the body or not? This is a very important point. And I would also refer you to this very interesting work on near-death experiences. I know that this is seen as parapsychology and all that, but there's a lot of clinical studies in top journals like Lancet and others. Near-death experiences, shared death experiences with vertical perceptions. So where they talk about after a cardiac arrest, there is flat EEG and ECG, everything is flat. The person is dead actually. There's no metabolism in the brain whatsoever, but they have experiences which are verified later. And there's a lot of data on this. So materialism is very problematic. It can't deal with this data. How would panpsychism deal with it? Because would you say that the intrinsic property of the brain is consciousness, but then that would be a problem here, right? Because the brain is dead here, the brain is not functioning at all. And you have data to suggest that consciousness is still alive. There's perception. There are blind people having NDEs where they can see. And the way materialists argue is they dismiss the data. They say that it's, but I'm pretty sure that we should be open enough to see whether is there a merit in including the data? So panpsychism has to deal with that. That would be one thing. Then I would also refer you to this very interesting paper in 2016 by Biernaki. I'll send you the reference, where he links IIT with Kashmir Shaivism. Probably you might have studied. So he talks about this Icha Shakti, Jnana Shakti, and Kriya Shakti, and how different levels of consciousness, so the gradation of consciousness. So Kashmir Shaivism probably is a good framework where, unlike Shankara's Advaita, it allows for this gradation of beings with different levels of causal power, which is similar to IIT's framework, So it sort of probably addresses your problem that you had, right? That idealism is not able to deal with that. So maybe that's one way to go about, and you're probably familiar with that work. What about other Indic frameworks? I know that you work in Sikhism, so I would like to learn more about that. Sikhism, then Ramanuja's philosophy, Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy. There's so many other frameworks, right? How do you, probably they could be brought in some way. I'm not sure. Okay, so I just wanted to mention these things. What about the other aspect would be the role of randomness, because if you posit pantheism, I think you're going to go for an intelligent universe, and randomness is probably not required. And frankly, I'm sympathetic to that. I think chaos theory can replace randomness, and chaos is intelligent way of simulating randomness. So you could have a god, not necessarily a personal god. You could have an intelligent, immanent, transcendent god, which is using this non-random deterministic behavior. There's a lot of scientific work can be sort of from that angle. So there's yeah, and the other thing is about this action. So I think so in some sense there are three pillars, right? You have ontology, epistemology, and axiology, right? The thing about worth and value. So you need to address all the three of them, as rightfully as Dr. Shriddha also said, that has to be addressed. And I think I was just listening to one talk by Swami Saurapriyananda, and he talks about the framework of Satchit Ananda, that Sat addresses ontology, Chit addresses epistemology, and Ananda addresses axiology. Of course, it's a very Advaitic framework. I'm not saying you should agree to that, but it's an interesting take that non-dualistic frameworks could address all three of them. Because one thing I notice is all these theories, they don't address happiness, right? Happiness is not addressed at all. How do you address happiness? So is it an attribute of consciousness? Is it intrinsic to consciousness? Is it just a feeling or a pleasure? Is it an epiphenomenon? So it's a long set of questions, but you don't have to answer all of them. You can take notes and you can get back, and I can send you some references. Yeah, but I'm not a philosopher, so please, I'm not an expert. I'm just an engineer, and you can always take my questions with a pinch of salt. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Professor Nitin, for the wonderful question. Varun, you would like to
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Nitin. I'm really delighted listening to your remarks and all. Especially, I'm familiar with near-death experiences, studies like Peter Fenwick and Pim von Lommel, and I completely sort of agree with you that there is data which materialists are not taking seriously. But my point is that implications are too huge. For instance, Peter Fenwick and these Pim von Lommel, and then there is this I'm forgetting the name, but a cardiologist in UK named Sam Parnia, who has done
the aware study. Yeah,
aware study, yes. And I'm familiar with the data, and I'm not sure, but there are counters to it. But but the implications are really radical, because then somehow there is this possibility of dualism to be true, in a way. But I have no problem if the data shows that, but hardcore materialist and panpsychist also would be disagreeing to that. So thank you so much for this. This is such a delight, listening to near-death experiences and other stuff. And especially with IIT and Kashmir Shaivism, there has been other works. For instance, Chakravarti Ramprasad specifically sort of talks about micropsychism, and Abhinav Gupta's Kashmir Shaivism. And then there is philosopher of religion, Lorelei Baranowski, she has written a very interesting short paper on Abhinav Gupta's notion of subjectivity, phenomenology of subjectivity, unifying with the causality of IIT. Yeah. Oh, thank you. So, but of course, IIT, I'm not an expert, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've read a bit about IIT. So there are problems, but I feel that IIT still stands firm as compared to other like global workspace theory and other theories that are lacking sort of empirical ground. But I might be wrong on this. I'm not sure about this. So, and then your last thing about pantheism and randomness. So let me clarify, like when we frame pantheism, the kind of pantheism that I'm trying to frame is not the pantheism that cannot take account of randomness. For instance, my pantheism is sort of a possibility. So possibility of consciousness and possibility of action is embedded in the universe in my understanding of pantheism, and I'm taking it from Whitehead. So it's not the teleological thing, it's not a teleology that this idea of action or consciousness is there since the inception of universe. The possibility of it is there. So I'm framing a pantheism that is non-teleological in nature. So that's it. Thank you so much for these remarks, and I'm glad, like, I hope we can sort of I hope we can discuss this further. Thank you so much.
So now I invite Swami Shama Chaitanya ji for the comments.
Yeah, first of all, my voice isn't okay, so I hope you are able to understand what I say. Thank you very much for sort of giving me an opportunity to actually listen to a very good discourse going on this in the Western Academy and the universities also here. What, however, is perhaps missing is that even though we are talking about non-dualism, we are talking about Western non-dualism, except for paying just some sort of just reference to words like Vedanta and Kashmiri Shaivism. Somehow there is a kind of either inhibition or maybe lots of interest or not just any curiosity about it, as to what exactly was the conversation here about the idea about consciousness. First of all, there's a bit of a problem with the English word consciousness. If you look at this word consciousness, we have several words in Sanskrit. One is chitta, then there is one is chitta. You have chidabhasa, you have buddhi, you have mana. So what are you talking about here? So I don't want to again give another parallel lecture on Indian philosophical take on this idea of consciousness. That is not the point, but I'm first of all very thankful to Varun because it was my request for him to summarize his ideas. In the last talk, I found he was very, very innovative in his intervention. So I wanted to hear him. And I think he should expand this wonderful paper, but then add a section on the Indian paper to make it very comprehensive. It's a wonderful paper. It needs to be expanded so that it could be a kind of, it sort of summarizes different viewpoints. You don't have to necessarily give your opinion to make it a paper. I think it's very, very educative. And it sort of captures, compiles, synthesizes the viewpoints of a series of philosophers of the West and the contemporaneous of the whole question. Coming to our point of view, I just wanted to tell you that with several words, the experience we're talking about, the word that we use is anubhava. And then we talk about what is yathartha anubhava, what is ayathartha anubhava, what is actually pramana. And here, when you talk about chit and this problem, the dichotomies which you face in the Western philosophy, because they are looking at consciousness and they have to then associate it either with the human body, and then you say that they have a panpsychism point of view, where then they're saying there is matter and then there is spirit or this consciousness, they're coterminals existing together. To that problem in Kashmiri Shaivism and Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, there is a completely different take on it. I just wanted to, without trying to make it complicated, because it's very complicated in our language, they have this word called apachedaka, or defining marker. So you have a field of consciousness, and then you are trying to explain multiplicity while you subscribe to a viewpoint of oneness. And you have a big challenge because then you have to make sense of life, activities, human beings, agencies, everything, but you have just one word called Satchidananda Swarupa. Now the Satchidananda, we have two, there are different ways when you define things in Sanskrit. One is something called Sakti Vritti, the other one is called Lakshana Vritti. Sakti is directly, there is a relationship between what you say, the language, and the referent, the artha. But sometimes there is no direct referent, and you're going in a roundabout way. So you have what is called Lakshana Vritti. So you have again Tatastha Lakshana, Swarupa Lakshana. The Satchidananda is actually a direct pointing at what is the truth, and that is a Swarupa Lakshana. Now, how then that one thing has become many, and that if you look at some of the Akhyayikas or the stories in Upanishads, that throws up a few alternative insights to what we heard today. For example, when Swetakriti is having a discussion with his father, he's trying to explain the nature of reality. The father tells his son, Sadeva Swamya idamagra ase. And then he said, Asadeva Swamya idamagra asid ekam eva advitya. Because what you said, that out of nothing, nothing can come out. Here in Bhagavad Gita, the verse number 16 of the second chapter, what does it say? Nasato vidyate bhavaha. Out of asat, you cannot have any bhava padartha. You cannot have something exists. Na bhavo vidyate sataha, and na abhavo vidyate of sat. You can never have absence of what is fundamentally real. And on that, if you look at Shankaracharya, he writes about 8-9 pages, and different other theorists in the Vedantic schools, they've given their views. But if you will relate that to the Akhyayika, the story in Chandogya Upanishad, Shankaracharya and other commentators have solved this by saying that creation is not a parinama. I mean, Ramanuja is a parinamavadi. The Brahman undergoes changes without losing his essential qualities. And same thing is true about Kashmiri Saivism. Because they have Achintya Sakti, the Vimarsha, Shiva with Sakti can just create anything he wants without losing. And in Gauranga, the Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy, what is called Achintya Bheda Veda, they say, who the hell are you to ask questions to God as to what he does? And he doesn't undergo any changes, but he can create these imageries, these views, these points of views, people, everything, without losing his sanctity, his absoluteness. But refuting Parinamavada, because the moment you say that consciousness undergoes some transformation to become matter, to become human beings, you are actually not allowing consciousness to remain conscious. There will be some issues, some problems. And there'll be this whole problem and confusion that in the Western parlance we face between matter and consciousness and it back and forth. So what word we have is, yes, Brahman is the source of everything, but it is a vivartopadana karana. So the whole reality is kind of a projection of it. The avyakrita, the invisible, the non-expressed, that which appeared unreal, and therefore it was referred to as asad, has manifested itself, had become visible. And somebody will say, oh, so again, you're talking about some kind of a change. I mean, the emergentism that you mentioned. They said, no. The stories about Srishti that you have Upanishads, the tatparya of those stories is not in actual Srishti. The tatparya is in realizing that the unified whole is actually pure Satchidananda Swarupa. These stories are to tell you that the ephemeral, transient reality with which you struggle, it's not a badhaka for Atmajnana. It's a badhaka if you don't understand it. It becomes sadhaka when you understand, then engage. And that is where I think indirectly that sort of answers this issue about what is the political relevance of whatever we do. Because if you look at Bhagavad Gita, Bhagavan says that you have to do karma yoga, and the whole discussion that you have to fight a just war, and then the war is metaphorically explained as life. I do not see this. There is some problem. I agree with you. There is a big problem. Swami Vivekananda mentioned it, that we talked about Advaita Vedanta and society had gender inequalities, social inequalities. We didn't talk about it. So he invented the word called practical Vedanta. But fundamentally within Advaita framework, theoretically it's not a problem to my mind. Because now think about dark matter, or think about a black hole. Now, where is reality, human being, human consciousness in the black hole? If you accept black hole, there'll be nothing except that field of energy. And then if there will be another creation, if there's another supernova, it's quite possible that again, everything will emerge. That means what it's mentioned in the Upanishads, that everything sort of goes back to a bija form, bijakara, a seed form. It becomes a karana, a causal form, which will not have the names and forms and qualities which you see in your everyday life. So that's how they sort of try to bypass the debate or the challenge of having to explain evolution, having to explain the manifestation, the reality which is so divisive and conflictual and blah, blah, blah. So I want to get into that's one question. Now, coming to what are the fundamental issues that we have discussing about this chit thing? You know, you sort of mentioned about this radical phenomenology, and I want to ask if you look at Patanjali, He's saying what is asampragyata samadhi, chitta vritti nirodha. Now, vritti, there is a beautiful word called vritti, which is experiential in a certain way. But when a person is meditating, he's in asampragyata samadhi, means that there is no reference to any object. There is only existence of the consciousness. The subject has vanished, because if the subject is present, it will become a sapragyata samadhi. There is agent, he's aware of himself and his state of samadhi. When he vanishes, only consciousness remains, that is asampragyata samadhi. Now, I want to know, would you like to refer to that as consciousness or not? It's a radical question. Now, all this debate that we're having, that you have to have some discussion about the body and the mind and blah, blah, it's true, it's there. But how do you make sense of that state of asampragyata samadhi? That's the question. And that sort of gives a pointer to the Vedanta thing. They're saying that meditating on that Mahavakyas, you reach a level in the consciousness. And remember, they're very realists. They are not saying like yoga people that you have to meditate to manipulate your consciousness, biochemical processes in your body to reach to that level that you are only aware of, like psychedelics. You're only aware of a unified field. They're not saying this. They're saying, the Vedanti is much more clever. He says, you know, with your understanding of physics and of your understanding of reality, the sky doesn't have any color. After you know, does the sky look blue or not? It will look blue. So they say this is Vastu Tantra. It is not Purusha Tantra. Purusha Tantra kartum, anyatha kartum, akartum shakya. You may do it, may not do it, you may do it some other way. But Vastu Tantra, you know this is a pen, it remains a pen. It cannot vanish. That's how they say that, because there will be anirmoksha prasanga, Shankaracharya says. If you do not accept realization as something real, it's a very realistic position. If you do not accept that, then you are essentially saying that it is a subjective state, which means it's not sustainable. You may come back to your confusions tomorrow. You go over, you go to a yoga camp, you come back, you have confusion. But Vedanta says, no, when you understand reality, even though you'll continue to see the same sansara and everything, that will be badhita. You know it's not there, but you pass through everything, there's not a problem. Because you continue to see the sky as blue, so there's no problem with multiplicity at all. And there is no need to reject the unified field. I do not want to use the word panpsychism, but I was just, because Varun is a brilliant person, I like the way he has tried to study this. So, you know, whether there are certain key questions like this jnana, chit or jnana, is it sakara, nirakara? Mrityunjay Mohanty has written a couple of interesting articles on that. You may have to, who was teaching in Temple University, now lives in Bengal. Like, for example, the Buddhists and the Vedantis say, if I'm looking at a pen, if I say this is black, now what about this consciousness of the statement when I'm saying this is black? They're saying there is tadakara vritti. The blackness of the pen, the consciousness has taken that form. Then only I'm saying is, then only I can have jnana of this black pen. Now this is very interesting, because for the Nyayikas, the jnana is actually not having form. Because they will ask a question, what about the jnana of this jnana that this is black? They have a word called anuvevasaya jnana. Aham janami iti janami. I know that I know. Well, how do you mention that? How do you make sense of it? So that there are a couple of these questions. And then, is it savishaya, nirvishaya? All knowledge or consciousness have to have an object, or it can be nirvishaya, without an object. Because these are some of the questions. And whether it's a dravya or guna or karma, is it an object? What is this consciousness? It's a substance, is a quality, or it's some kind of activity. If you look at the schools of thought that you narrated and summarized in a wonderful way, you'd say that somewhere they are touching upon these three words, that dravya, or it's a quality, or it's like it's a quality of the body or the biological system that we have. No, it's actually karma, some kind of a vritti, some kind of a going on, a state of change, some experiential process, or it's actually a substance. So there are different ways. So I was just thinking that in case there's another beautiful word other than vivarta, that you would like to look at is called Upadhi. So Upadhi is what? It's a kind of branding, a labeling. Same consciousness. When they say this abachinna, you see, you have a node, the subject, the known, the jnaya, and the process, knowing process. There are three things in philosophy. They're saying this process of knowing is also consciousness. They call it Vritya Varchinna Chaitanya. And what is this one? The jnaya vastu? There's a Vishya Varchinna Chaitanya. And this is what the knower, then Antakarana Varchinna Chaitanya. This word you are referring to as consciousness, Antakarana. That Chidabhasa. And then Panchadasikara Vidyaranya Muni gives a beautiful example. They're saying there is this Akasha, this whole universe. Okay. Then imagine that you have a pot of water and it's nighttime, it's a full moon night. So there is Ghatakasa. Ghatakasa is the space inside that particular pot. And then on the surface of the pot, these beautiful stars and the moon are getting reflected. And when somebody asks that guy or a boy who's looking at it, where is Akasa? He points at the Jalakasa. That is the Akasa. But actually, yeah, I'll just wind up. I'll just 2 more minutes. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So, you know, there are 3 things you're talking about. You are talking about the Mahakasa. You're talking about the Ghatakasa. So the Ghatakasa is comparable with what is called Pratyak Chaitanya or Shakshi Chaitanya in all of us. It's not different from the Mahakasa. Because Ghatakasa is just a form. There's only Akasa. It's a naming thing that we indulge in. And they say, but the boy is looking at that reflected sky, the moon and the stars and the surface of water. He's looking at the Jalakasa, and that is the Chidabhasa. They say Buddhi Pratifalita Chaitanya. So what we are referring to as consciousness here, largely in Indian parlance, will be Chidabhasa. So I was just thinking that in future, I wish with your curiosity and your dedication, if you sort of, I will try to contact, there's a professor, I think he teaches in San Jose or somewhere. His name is Thaneshwar Timala Singha. The people, they are bright people teaching in Delhi University colleges, they would know. He has written a book on consciousness in Indian tradition. He has written a book on Drishti Srishtivada. You know, I think you can have, and I'd like to also listen to him if he can give a talk online, because he's an expert in Kashmiri Saivism. He's not a traditional Vedanti. He's more into Tantra. He's a Nepalese. So he is heavily influenced by Tantra. So these are some of these questions, and these are challenges. I don't want to get into it. You have done a very good work, and but I was a little, you know, curious that we are sort of absolutely, we're talking about Vedanta. We are dropping the word Kashmiri Saivism, but we are absolutely not talking about Indian philosophy at all. Neither, except that in a couple of questions they came. It may be very important. I suggest that we look at the Sankhya thing, because they talked about the, you know, that Chit thing is actually Purusha and Prakriti, and how the Sanniti creates this whole world. The Sankhya view and the Nyaya view and the Vedanta and Kashmiri Saivism. These 4 will bring in a perhaps alternative way of looking at it. And then you can, recently somebody has also written a book on Sankara and Heidegger. You must have seen that book, right? So there is a bit of a debate going on, if you can sort of bring it. End of the day, we are trying to sort of explore ways in which we can, in an organic manner, stay connected with the ancient knowledge systems here, at the same time, engage with new, alternative, non-Indian points of view. Thank you so much. Wonderful effort, and thank you, Maninderji, for giving me a chance to listen to this wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Swamiji.
Thank you so much, Swamiji. I'm agreeing with you that I haven't sort of thoroughly explored Indic system that I have mentioned, but I would love to engage with it more. And I agree that we tend to sort of give more emphasis to Western philosophical framework, and that is part of our academic tradition. And we tend to sort of use concepts from Indic tradition without thoroughly engaging with them in its own context. And that is a limitation. But specifically the point that you have mentioned, that theoretically no problem in Vedanta, theoretically there is no problem in Vedanta that might resist the question, resist entertaining the question of inequality. I think this is very important. This question is very crucial, because a lot of time there has been allegation that has put against Indic philosophy that it is very obscure, it's very arcane, mysterious, and it's not very intelligible to the people, and it does not look into the core questions of materiality and political economy. But I agree with you that it could be the problem in practice. It could be the problem where our society got framed in the recent times. But theoretically, I agree with you that there has been a lot of insights which are not useful for the philosophical purpose only, but also for concrete economic, political purpose. And I can't agree more with you on this. And
if I can just get 1 second, because something beautiful coming to my mind. I'll just tell you 2 sentences about a wonderful story. There was this story I've heard in traditional parlance. There was a guy called Narayan Pandit. He was doing a yaga. There was a poor Brahmin. And he sort of went to, his wife said, why don't you go and sit there, you'll get some dakshina. But he didn't know too much Sanskrit. He was afraid to go, but then he was pushed by his wife, and he went there and he sat. And he said, Ya Devi Sarva Bhuteshu Sarva Saktirupana Taha Namastasmei. You should say Tasye, because that is feeling. Namastasmei, Namaste. Now, Narayan Pandit was walking by. He said, where did you get this guy? He doesn't know any Sanskrit. He came off the field. He fell down. And he came back embarrassed, humiliated, hungry, no food, no money. His wife was waiting that the husband will come back with some dakshina, some food. They were very poor people. And the wife said, what happened? He said, I was humiliated. It forced me to go there. And then both of them slept, drinking some water, because it was a hot summer evening. And they were very tired, slept. And in the night, at about 2 o'clock, this Narayan Pandit came running with a lot of food and everything, and dakshina. He was knocking at the door. The moment he saw Narayan Pandit, he got scared that I'm going to get another round of beating. But actually, Narayan Pandit apologized. What happened to Narayan Pandit is that when he went to sleep, in his sleep, he saw he's standing in the middle of great effulgence, light all around. And he's hearing the one voice, Tasyai Tasmaiva. Now, God is asking him, you want to address me as a mother or father? So, these alternative beautiful insights are there in the Advaita tradition. We are not even getting there. That is another issue. But these, I personally, when I heard this, I was teaching a small paper on feminist theory to some students in Bhubaneswar those days. But I was in tears when I heard this from a traditional Brahmin. He said, for you, God is woman or man. But the answer is, he is beyond these divisions. And depends on how you want to relate to him. So I'd stop there. Thank you so
much. Varun, do you want to respond to this? Or do you have comments?
I agree with you. And if I have the time, I think the question in a way Swamiji was trying to ask about samadhi, like how do you perceive samadhi? How can we understand samadhi? I don't know, but it could be equated with something called pure awareness, which is not the meta consciousness that humans have, which is self-reflective state, but it could be equated with pure consciousness, which is there in all Eastern tradition. For instance, it is there in the emphasis of that has been given in Zen Buddhism, in other traditions also. So it's my speculation only, but samadhi, the state like samadhi could be seen as pure awareness or as the phenomenal experience, which is different from the self-reflective state of meta-consciousness. So
now I invite Rashi Shroom for her the next discussion from JNU. So I invite you for your comment.
I'm very grateful to be a part of this this talk, and honestly, I'm also not pretty sure about how rookie my articulations might be, but excited at the same time, because I think I might be reiterating a certain points which have already been made, and I'm amazed how did they came to me, because other people, of course, here are much better placed to be knowing about them. So I will quickly come to 2-3 points that I have in mind when I think about this discourse on consciousness, and of course which become very striking with the paper that Varun presented. the questions which I have are, the way I see it, it's basically there seems to be a stream of questions regarding consciousness and kind of questions regarding reality. And I think this discourse is conflating the two to start with. So we are saying that consciousness is either a thing in itself, or consciousness is a mental state, or we are saying that the mental state is a thing in itself. And that is in some way an aspect of the reality, but to what extent it is the aspect of reality that can explain reality to us. So I think we are kind of losing upon that also, because as Chaitanya sir noted, that this discourse, this language is in itself inherently, I think, limited to grasp this layered understanding, which Indian philosophical terminology, I think, is better suited to address. I feel so also because he mentioned this term antahkaran, and I was also thinking that would antahkaran be considered a part of consciousness? But again, the question would be that antahkaran, as in the dictionary sense, would translate into an internal organ which manifests into buddhi, man, and consciousness, and also there's one more part which ego. So basically intellect, intellect, mind, ego, and consciousness.
Ahankara for Vedanta, yeah.
Yes. But there, Chit word is also for Vedanta, you said, sir, but I think in Sankhya it would be included, it would include the idea of consciousness, the Chit part. And if then it is included in Antakaran, then consciousness becomes not equivalent to Antakaran, but some part of it, some part of the internal organ, which we are kind of not considering enough at this moment, but I think would definitely need consideration. Because the second aspect, which I am kind of, which I would like to bring in here, is more about this importance of mental categories in terms of cognition, experience, thinking, understanding, all that we associate with the mind, or all that mind enables, I think are inevitable when we think of the idea, think of the question of consciousness. But when we extend to the questions of reality, I think the same category of mind might become something which has to be transcended. So this primacy of experience that is recurrently coming across in the discourse, and the idea of self, I think it itself becomes something to be transcended to realize the reality. So there is also kind of a break that we are kind of not taking into account enough. But I think that is also probably because experience has this this importance also, because I think experience is what makes the self important. Like the self is important because it is because we associate experience with it, and it is this association is important because when we think of our living aspect, which ma'am said, the ontology of action, the living part, where we how do we make sense of these abstract questions of reality with the living part? But I think it is as much as important these questions are, and as much as the primacy of experience has to be to some extent kind of acknowledged, we also will have to see that it is something which is fundamentally to be transcended to understand the nature of reality, or to understand reality in itself. So when there comes a break, I think we'll also have to reconsider how much importance can really be given to experience or the mental categories. So I'm not denying that they are not important. Of course they are important, and as I said, in the living part, probably in much of the ontological that we currently ascribe to as ontological, when we are saying that consciousness is the reality, their experience seems important. But when we say that that reality may not really be just consciousness, but the question becomes important, that what is it that one becomes conscious of? Like what if it is a mental state, if it is a space, as you have also mentioned in the paper, like gravity, space, and time, if it is that kind of a layer, and it's still a mental state, like it's like, is there a larger mind at work of which becomes conscious, and which consciousness is kind of a aspect of? But then the question still remains, like, what does it become conscious of? If it becomes conscious of the reality, then I think the discourse is going in the right direction. But if not, I think we are still beating around the same bush and not really taking into account the real question that is of reality, which consciousness has to address and not limit. Also, I think there is one more point that I wanted to make about panpsychism. And my fundamental concern with panpsychism is that, is panpsychism saying that matter is a requisite for mind, or rather that matter is essential for mind to be there? So it is definitely not saying, it is definitely not dualistic, as it is said, that it says that mind or consciousness is a fundamental property of all that is matter. And in saying otherwise, that matter entails mind. Now, what does that really mean? Are we saying that matter is essential? Then what form of matter, as has been pointed out by Nagaraj sir, that we have to take into account of that, like what becomes the unit of analysis? But it is not just that. I think it is also maybe not so much what Spinoza is saying, as is also your argument, because when Spinoza says that mind and matter are different attributes of one single substance, it is, mind and matter become attributes of it. If I were to frame it in a kind of syncretic form through the Indian philosophical terminology, it would be that Prakriti and Purush, I'm going to be like very wrong, but Prakriti and Purush are the two attributes of Brahm. Brahm is also as much a part of Prakriti, as much a part of the Purush, and as much a part of their interaction. So in saying that panpsychism is, that Spinoza is saying the same kind of thing, in that there is a single attribute of which, a single substance of which mind and matter are different attributes. How is panpsychism saying the same thing? I think panpsychism is saying that mind is the attribute of matter. So I think, I'm not sure if it is exactly like what I have understood, but this is like my concern with panpsychism at this moment. And then like there's also another, I'm sorry, but there's one more concern with regard to the ontological and the political. I think much of the political that we know, or rather the ethical, is in dialectic with the political. And by political, I'm meaning the very conventional understanding of power. And there being some kind of a power negotiation, which I would ascribe to political, and ethical is very much determined by the political, and as in it is in a dialectic. Sometimes like there is some kind of an ethic which is some kind of an ethical is so basically there's a dialectic, and there's a continuous give and take between the two categories. But what my concern is that we see the current political to be very much driven by expediency, and it is something that we just come to work with because it is convenient. It is not something which I'm saying occurs only at the highest level of institutions of state wala politics, but also in our everyday living. That it is something which is convenient, and we do it. We just go with it. How much reflective is that political of the ontological that we are concerned with? The reality is really political, that ontological, if it is so much mediated by the concerns for expediency. So I think those would be like some of my questions. I think that does it. Also, there's a kind of a proposition to just think about this kind of an understanding to Nagel's question of, if I may say it, would it be fine? I'm sorry. Would it be fine to? May I?
Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. I have a proposition with regard to Nagel's question on what is it like to be a bat, and I'm thinking, if all of the things that exist, and if I see it, if I call it Prakriti, that is Prakriti as in the elemental, the chemical, physical, material existence, all of it, and the interactions which go in it, within it. If everything is in the Prakriti, and we are also in it, and a bat is also in it. So what if it is really possible for us to realize through our consciousness, now I'm using the term consciousness here, to realize to some extent, maybe not experience it, but realize something about what it might feel like to be a bat. And I would want to propose to think about, suppose airplanes. Like if we were able to realize something, like we in Prakriti realized something about birds, something about flying organisms, and we realized that something about flight, there has to be some kind of a realization. So for us to be able to recreate that experience, for us to be able to recreate that property of flight itself. So like besides science, might say that pattern recognition, and we try to kind of recreate it. We try to verify it if it is possible with certain kinds of tools and matter and shapes and forms. But fundamentally, when we are when this idea comes that we can fly, were we trying to kind of in some ways realize something through our consciousness that expanded into the consciousness of the bird, which is the part of the same Prakriti, that we actually somewhere always already knew what it would be to fly. So to Nagel's question, maybe it can be said that maybe we can to some extent know that what it is like to be a bird. I'm not sure, it can be very stupid, but I just thought of it today, so I said that I thought I would share. So yeah, thank you. I think that is it.
Yeah, thanks, Rashi, for the wonderful discussion. And Varun, would you like?
Yeah, thank you so much, Rashi, for these thought-provoking and interesting question. But I mean, your first question is about consciousness and reality, that are we just focusing on consciousness and trying to sort of ignore reality? I would say no. The paper was in fact an attempt to understand reality itself, in the sense that it was trying to argue that what reality is. What is the ground of reality? Is it material? Is it consciousness? Is it some other thing? Like you mentioned about Spinoza. So Spinoza, you rightly pointed out, was a dual aspect monist, which means that there is one substance which manifests as multiple substances, right? Which has multiple properties. It could manifest as mind, it could manifest as matter, and also in other fashions. So this is the core question, that what reality constitutes of. Is it mental? Is it material? Your proposition is that reality, I'm trying to make a distinction between consciousness and reality, and then the purpose should be to sort of understand reality. But then one has to ask this question, that what reality is. We cannot evade this question. What it is, what is it, its ground? What is it made up of? And in my understanding, it could be material, it could be mental, or it could be some other neutral substance, like Russellian panpsychism, which is neutral monism, frames a different substance, which is altogether different from matter and material, which is neutral, which could be some quantum vacuum, or could be anything else. So that is it. And your other questions about ontology of action, I think I've discussed this, that I don't think that panpsychism in any sense evades this question of ontology of action. I think it provides a firm ground for action to be grounded, it provides a ground for action to be grounded in a metaphysical base. And then this difference between self-experience and reality. So I think the question of self is a concomitant question, is a related question, but not exactly the same question. And when we say consciousness, as I pointed out, it is not about self, because self is what we have, which is basically by its very nature self-reflexive, which we can contemplate about it, which has been called as consciousness, being conscious of our own consciousness. So which is a meta thing, which is somewhat meta consciousness. But so I'm taking that into cognizance, but simultaneously trying to argue that this debate of panpsychism is more about what is the nature of reality at its fundamental. And the question of self and substance and subject are important, but they are concomitant question. They are not exactly the same. So that is it. I mean, we can discuss it further. Thank you so much.
All right. So thanks a lot for this wonderful kind of the discussion we have with all of the discussants and the Varun's response to that. And with this, the floor is open for the question and answers, please.
Can I request Maninderji to make his concluding remarks?
Yeah, if there is any other question, we can take that. Otherwise, I would like to come in. Is there any other question? No, okay, I think we have already spent almost 2.5 hours, and we would like to hear SAURABH and his comment on this. Thank you, Varun, and thank you all the discussants to bring the discussion at this high level. And I am trying to comprehend all the points made. I'm not sure if I'm at the moment able to really grasp all the issues raised. But Varun, I have 2-3 issues. One is that are we taking consciousness as another aspect of reality, which is independent of us? Like you said, it's a field. So we become conscious of something, or consciousness happens to us as it is in the field in which we are existing, like the gravity is acting upon us. So consciousness is kind of happening to us. And there are many techniques of arriving there or taking this from there. And schools of thought that we have mentioned are grappling, how do we acquire that? How does it happen to us? How do we engage with that? So in that case, the question of body and mind gets dissolved. This duality gets dissolved, means that now there is a field which is independent, existing independent of human beings. And human beings are becoming, are exposed to that. All of us are not equally exposed to that field. Like I'm just imagining that there's a river flowing, and sometimes we go and take dip, or we don't take dip, depends on us. If we go and take dip, we have a particular kind of experience. If we don't have that experience. And there are many ways to arrive to the river and take dip. And there are many spaces in the flowing river where we can take that dip. So that's why it looks more complex. So in that case, is it a reality which is existing independent of us? And we are, as human beings, we have that reflexive capacity, as you said, which makes us capable of arriving to the river or experiencing that the depth of the river. I'm not trying to be anthropocentric, because we don't know whether animals have any depth of that experience or not. We have no idea, except that behaviorally probably we see that since they behave differently, so we think that they don't have. But if we accept that, then probably the domain of debate will shift somewhere else. And that is where I think the concern of SHYAMA Chaitanya would be interesting. That is it that since we are debating about consciousness in the language, which is very different, and therefore we are not actually able to capture the complexity. This is one thing. Second thing is that this Purush and Prakriti thing, if they are part of the same reality, and we are trying to see the reality, there's a meeting of the reality, the Purush part and the Prakriti part, there's a meeting of the reality, and that is the climax of experience. And that experience transforms us politically also. Something that is being discussed by, say, Tagore in his small monograph called Sadhana that we were discussing in the class. So is it that that experience of arriving there or touching that, that core transforms us, and that transforms all our behavior also? Like I was talking to one new religion guru, and he was telling me, and his disciples were telling me, that how there are different layers of consciousness, and he has devised 28 techniques of achieving that highest level, and they are graded techniques. So my question to them was that once you achieve that, does that transform you politically or not? Or does that transform you as a human being outside this ashram or not? So that is something that makes me very puzzled, that why did they don't transform there? So is it that that transformation is spontaneous, or is it that something that we experience in different fragmented ways? And in that case, our experiences captured by neurologists or neuroscientists, captured by psychiatrists, captured by other people, are different layers of our being conscious. So that would be another puzzle for me. What is that? And yeah, I think I will stop here at the moment. There are so many things coming to my mind because we have been debating for the last many years about these things. The last thing, Varun, that this panpsychism, as I've already objected to this formalism, if we consider everything as conscious, or if everything has consciousness, then as Shraddha raised this question, is there a hierarchy of that or not? Is it just an imagination? And that imagination is politically very interesting, as you said, that makes you more inclusive. Or is it true that, is it real that even a glass has consciousness? And you are saying that probably all these particles also are conscious. So what is the reality check for that? Is there a reality check for that? How do we know that? How do we accept that? Accept that, is it an assumption? Or is there some evidence for that? And if the evidence is experiencing, just experiencing, then that's a very difficult evidence to share. Something that we were discussing last evening with, I was discussing with SHYAMA Chaitanya, that if you connect reduce with experience, which is important, but then is there any way to discuss about that? Talk about it. Yeah, I'll just stop here.
Varun, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you. I think these are really important insights, and we have discussed this previously, but I would say, coming back to your last question first, trying to sort of understand your last question first, I would say that it's not about that the glass is conscious or the rock is conscious. Panpsychism, I don't think any panpsychist would say that rock is conscious, but they would say that the fundamental unit of reality is consciousness. Now, then the other question is that, is there hierarchy? for instance, that somebody say, and then this fundamental unit of reality is consciousness, and then the constituent matter, the constituent elements of any component, for instance, a rock, could definitely not be meta-conscious, could definitely not be self-reflexive, but they constitute the possibility of self-reflection. So it's called possibility, potential that gets actualized in humans. So definitely there is this danger, sometimes it's called danger, and philosophers like Rubinstein and all, they have argued that panpsychism, though, is much more plausible and parsimonious, but it also has this component of hierarchy inbuilt into it. And I agree with that. And that is what the limitation is in a way. And one needs to find the answer to that limitation, that if it is hierarchical, so the ethics that might be framed from this philosophical / metaphysical position could also have hierarchical implications. But I feel that it's more parsimonious. Materialism is depressing in a way, and it leads to a kind of politics we all know. I mean, I don't, although there are hardcore materialists who would definitely reply me for that, but I don't think there is any hope for materialism. Idealism is also parsimonious in a way, as Professor Nitin has also pointed out, but idealism has its own problems. We can discuss it. I feel that out of the positions that we have right now in the contemporary philosophy of mind and cognitive science, panpsychism position, or it's one of its versions like cosmopsychism, could be a better contender. And that is what I've tried to argue. I can definitely delve into it further and can look into these questions, and one should look into these questions more seriously. But that is a challenge, and then one needs to deal with. But your first
Varun, just let me just say one word. I think between idealism and materialism, there is something called realism. So I would actually intervene from there, not from either idealist or materialist. Is it realist what you are saying?
But what reality is like real? I know and I agree with your position. But then my question is that what is this realism is? Like, is it mental in nature? Is it material? Because my paper and my concern has always been this, that what is the fundamental nature of reality? What is the origin of consciousness? So realism, for instance, Roy Bhaskar, I was reading Roy Bhaskar, a very interesting paper today only by Marvin Hatwig, who was comparing Roy Bhaskar's meta-realism with Terence Bacon's idea. And Bhaskar is taking a panpsychist position. I'm coming to this conclusion in meta-realism. His idea of cosmic envelope is very close to cosmopsychism of panpsychism. So I would say panpsychism is realist, or idealist would say that idealism is realist. Materialist would say that materialism is realist. So I think realism is definitely worth taking, but then one has to address this question.
All right. So
I have a question too here. I'm sorry, but like you said that what is the fundamental nature of reality? Is it mind or is it matter? Why can't it be both? Why can't it be an interaction of both?
Panpsychism is all about that.
I don't really see that. I think it is ultimately getting to the point where it is saying that mind is entailing matter. And that is not resolving this tussle between mind or matter.
Matter and mind are intertwined. So when you say entangled, intertwined, and meshed, so it's not a relationship which is where one cannot exist without the other.
Yeah, I think let us now share.
So is there any further question, or should I?
I just wanted to clarify. There was a question of Purusha and Prakriti. There are two views in Sankhya. The Purusha and Prakriti run parallel. Both are Swatantra. In Vedanta, the Prakriti is Purushadhina. So in a certain sense, Prakriti has no independent existence, because the moment you agree Prakriti is separate from Purusha, I think Varun was rightly answering the young friend from JNU who was asking this question. The moment you accept that Prakriti or matter is different from consciousness, then you're accepting duality. So it will not become non-dual. I'll stop there.
Saurabh ji, Atman has raised his hand.
Yes, there.
Atman, you could go ahead, ask your question, please.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question regarding how we are approaching there was a point regarding how materialism has failed us in terms of hierarchical institutions, and how the possibility of a hierarchy existing in panpsychism also is a concern that needs to be addressed if we are trying to arrive at a political system where hierarchies can be avoided. I'm not sure how it is that we are leveling this charge against materialism, because if I may reduce the political systems broadly to the extremes of capitalism and communism, I don't think it's the case that, though we do tend to view both as an outcome of materialism, whereas capitalism we talk about accumulation, and in communism we are talking about the absence of hierarchy. Both of these are only possible if we are also simultaneously considering the entrepreneurial spirit within capitalism and the alienation of labor within communism. So as being necessary premises. So I'm not sure whether these two matters are even related, in the sense that it's not the question about whether panpsychism lends us to a more equitable approach to politics, but more about the eagerness of politics to view any development in any other ontological framework as a way to reinterpret itself. And which is why I'm saying I don't clearly see how it is that our approach has to have a significant impact on the politics of it. And also another question, it's a little slightly unrelated question. If we have no way to talk about the potential consciousness of a rock, and all we're left with is the possibility of that consciousness, then where does the consciousness of the individual unit aggregate unto? That it's there in the individual unit and it's absent in the entire spectrum, and then reasserts itself either in humans or in animals, depending on how anthropocentric we are in this debate. Those are the two questions.
Varun, would you like to respond?
Yeah. Thank you. I think it's an interesting question. I think your first question is about materialism. I think materialism, fundamental problem with materialism is that no materialist theory of consciousness has been able to, first of all, as I mentioned, able to solve this hard problem of consciousness. That why do we have it first at the first point of, why do we have the experience at the first hand? Like, why do we have experience in the first place? Sorry. And secondly, this understanding of matter. So when I say panpsychism is not, that is what makes panpsychism different from idealism. Panpsychism takes matter seriously, but it's not reductive or eliminative materialism. It's something like a vital materiality. And continental philosophers like William Connolly, James Bennett, and Latour and all, these are basically arguing that the fundamental question of politics should be the question of what is matter. What is object? What is matter? And they are taking it seriously. And I think there are only two positions in contemporary which are reasonable. One is eliminative materialism, or there is vital physicalism, which vital physicalism is very close to panpsychism. This is what the proposition that I'm trying to make, that it takes materiality seriously without reducing everything to matter. And when it comes to, for instance, you talked about capitalism and all, there has been recent work on Marx. For instance, there is a theorist named Thomas Nail who has written a work, who's done a comparative study of Alfred Whitehead and Marx, and he has framed something called new materialism from the Marxist perspective. And he's trying to argue that Marx, in his early days, when he was engaging in philosophical stuff, especially his PhD thesis, was engaging with these questions, and there need to be more elaboration on these things. But what has happened right now is that we have completely ignored, political philosophy has completely ignored the question of ontology and metaphysics, taking only sociality as the framework of materiality, social relations as the framework of materiality. I feel people like Latour and all, they are doing much more profound work by going into the ontology of what matter is, what mind is, where is it suffused in nature, where does it exist. So I think they are more insightful right now. And when I criticize materialism, I don't criticize all kinds of materialism. I mean, I criticize this aspect of materialism, and I take panpsychist position because it takes materiality equally seriously as it takes a question of mind and consciousness seriously, in a way.
Okay. Any other questions we do have?
I don't think so, Saurabh.
Okay.
You can have.
Okay, so I just give some because already late, so I would just like try to be brief. So thanks a lot. Mallikarjun has just raised the hand. So
yeah, sorry for raising the hand late. Varun, wonderful talk. I just wanted to ask you that since we are raising the question of what is the nature of reality itself, and we are, am I audible?
Yeah, audible.
So, and we are saying that we are moving away from eliminative materialism, or sort of a crude materialism. So then, I think you would say, we can say that it's a sort of a vitalist sort of flavor of materialism. There is something more. So in this case, then there will be implications for the method of modern science itself, as in the nature of the empirical, or what counts as evidence itself, the criteria will change. Since right now the understanding of reality itself is physicalist, so our criteria of evidence is also physicalist and mathematical or quantifiable. So if reality itself is more than matter, then the criteria for evidence would be more than to correct knowledge about reality would more than mathematically precise quantified data. So how would sort of, since you mentioned something on quantum mechanics, I just wanted to know, like, how are the implications for this being raised in sort of tackled in science?
Shall I answer? Yeah. Thank you so much, Mallikarjun. I think I don't think that in science, for instance, if I can reframe your question, you are trying to say that in science, reality is seen as from a physicalist standpoint. I think Bernardo Kastrup is very important figure in this, because he says that science is metaphysically neutral. It is our metaphysical assumption, tacit metaphysical assumption of treating materialism / physicalism as the nature of reality, so that we, by tacitly accepting that, we tend to indulge in this mistake of treating reality as materialistically, and then science would try to understand that reality from a materialistic method. But I think there is no materialistic method. And panpsychism, for instance, integrated information theory is precisely doing the same, that it is using the insights of neuroscience and the method of neuroscience, but also simultaneously acknowledging the primacy of experience. So it is mathematically plausible, takes a scientific method into cognizance and experience into cognizance. So I think, first of all, it's a myth, as Kastrov also points out, that science is biased towards materialism. I think it's primarily our perspective about reality and the way we have indulged in science. And I think it's a very contemporary thing, because earlier philosophers of science like Whitehead and all were very critical of materialism. And Bertrand Russell, for instance, despite all his agnosticism about mysticism and all, we know he was a panpsychist, and his brilliant work on analysis of matter, he's trying to argue that what we know about physics tells us about the behavior of particles rather than the intrinsic nature of particles. So I think that is what it is, that it is our assumption, and one needs to challenge that assumption. Thank you.
All right, so we conclude Q&A session with this, and I would just like to be brief in my comments actually. So this has been really very wonderful and a thought-provoking presentation, and you have so as I said, the gamut is very wide. You have covered a lot of aspects. So what I would like to give comment on, because there are so many areas which I'm not expert of, but one area which I would like to comment from the perspective of the radical, basically from the perspective of phenomenology. So at one point of your presentation, you criticize phenomenology, especially radical embodied phenomenology, by arguing that it doesn't talk about the metaphysics because it doesn't ask the question, what is consciousness? Now, according to phenomenology, that is asking too much from the phenomenologists, because phenomenologists, especially in the Heideggerian phenomenology, we say that that is actually anti-metaphysical. And why they are anti-metaphysical? If we read like Being and Time of Heidegger or the Nietzsche's lecture, so Heidegger's question is that the question of the being has always in the metaphysical tradition, has in the history of philosophy, has been asked that the question of the being has always understood in terms of the entity, what is called the presented hand. Sometimes in the Nietzsche lecture, he says, okay, sometimes you call it as a being, sometimes you call it as a god, sometimes you call it as a becoming. But it is always, there is a objectifying the thing. So especially in the later Heidegger, the whole tendency, how to think of the question of the being, how to think of outside of this metaphysical objectifying tendencies. And what is his response is going back to the poetic thinking. And why the poetic thinking is requiring? Because it is not something which objectifies the thing, which lets the essence, what he calls the Gelsenheit, let the things be, let the essence of the things be, rather than objectifying it. So that is why he used so many kind of the new kind of the philosophical vocabularies, new for which is, kind of notorious in the, especially in the analytical philosophy. Now, the thing is that, when we say is actually that, so this evading of the question of the metaphysics is like kind of, at least in Heidegger, is deliberate. And if we talk about the phenomenology in general, so when they talk about that, why they don't think of this metaphysical question, right? Because that is the different kind of the methodological framework they use. Because very idea of the phenomenology, either it's Husserl or Heidegger or the Merleau-Ponty, like coming back to the experience. Right. And when we come back to the experience, we find, okay, that in the experience, the things like word and subject and object, word and mind, all these are body and the mind, all are coexisting with each other. Only in the abstraction, that is their complaint. When we become from the phenomenology, we go to the abstraction, then we divide that, right? Then we go into the abstraction, and then these kind of the problem occurs actually, right? This kind of the problem. So I think the phenomenology technically cannot go into that direction, because that is not the methodological framework they are espousing. In fact, even Merleau-Ponty, when you criticize that, he talks about the body, it is a like of, like a physicalism or kind of reductionism kind of the thing. But even in Merleau-Ponty, when we talk that his shift from the phenomenology of perception to the visible and invisible, that is exactly because of this. Because in the phenomenology of perception, there is a kind of the Cartesianism, a tacit Cartesianism, or a kind of the tacit metaphysics was there. So that is why in the later works, when he talk about the chiasm, flash, intertwining, he just want to come out of that framework by giving the new kind of the vocabularies, which dissolve these kind of the dualistic kind of the thinking. And on this note, actually, I find, like kind of the convergence between between phenomenology, especially in the later Heidegger and in the later Merleau-Ponty of visible and invisible, and what you end up in panpsychism with respect to the politics, because both of these traditions, we see that a kind of the displacement of the man. Then man is kind of the displaced from the center, and it is not the man who is giving the meaning to the word, which was the anthropocentrism. So in the later in the phenomenology, like the phenomenology of Heidegger, and also in the post-textualism and in the panpsychism, the man has been discentered. So that is paving the way to the post-humanism and all that. So that is why I like your question of the God as developed by you, which is beyond the anthropocentric kind of the God. And interestingly, in phenomenological framework, especially in the phenomenology of Jean-Luc Marion, when he talks about the saturated phenomena in the theological term of, so he basically argues that, see, that God is something which is a saturated phenomena. He said traditional phenomenology, just take the example of the table shares, which is like, you know, like where the consciousness can objectify that. And consciousness, this transcendental consciousness kind of something which is trying to combine all these things. While in the experience, but he said there are some overwhelming phenomena like experience of the God and mystical experience which completely disrupts the subject. And then the subject cannot kind of can come back and give the, use that kind of the objectifying language. So on this aspect, I find there is a, so this I find interesting that there is a kind in the panpsychism and in the both, in this theological phenomenology, there is a kind of convergence in terms of the politics. And what I see, that is my humble submission, that I think that I don't see your paper as a confrontation between the phenomenology or a panpsychism, and I don't think there is a kind of a rather there is a kind of the explanatory gaps, or there is a kind of a theoretical flaws. But I think both their positions are like there is a kind of the methodological differences in their position. Like what the methodological framework which phenomenology will take is something, you know, the panpsychism, because for panpsychism, the fundamental question is important, like what is like in the analytical philosophical framework, while in phenomenology will take more later vertical time position that we need to dissolve and come out of this, you know, philosophy is kind of the perpetual age actually. So yeah, so with this, I close my comments. And now what would, I think, Shailja, we need now.
Yes, yeah, we can conclude. Yes.
Yes. So now this is a time for the vote of thanks, because it's been the very wonderful and the thought-provoking evening, and it's a feast of thought. And of course, we thank Varun for, you know, kind of giving us such a treat of thought. And yeah. So first of all, we would like to thank actually the Forum for Contemporary. There's a foundation for the creative social research, and especially this group, Knowledge and the Practice group. And of course, we would like to thank Professor Maninder Thakur for making this happen. And we would also like to thank Varun, Dr. Shraddha, Professor Nitin, Rashi, and Shailja, of course, because she has been arranging and kind of coordinating with all of us. And with this, we end this today's discussion.
Thank you, Saurabh sir. And we would like to also thank you for chairing the session and graciously accepting our invitation. And also Swami ji for being the discussant. I would now conclude our session. Before that, Dr. Thakur sir, if there's anything else to be said, or should I just go? Your audio is muted.
Yeah, it's fine. Just that I would like to request other people to also make presentation to this forum. Like I'm seeing Dr. Nagaraj around. So if he can promise to present something to continue the discussion. And also SHRIDDHA and SAURABH and SHYAMA Chaitanya, if we can think of having series of papers. We want to call it Rishikesh Dialogue on Consciousness, as this dialogue started in Rishikesh when I reached there to have a kind of a spiritual retreat with Swami SHYAMA Chaitanya. We have been friends for many years, but I met him for the first time as Swami Chaitanya, SHYAMA Chaitanya. Even now, my mind is not habituated of calling him Swami. I keep calling him Satya, which I used to call him like earlier. But I'm sure he has been great inspiration behind this initiation of this dialogue. He is one of those who have access to both the traditions. And I think he has spent last 5-7 years to learn this, in learning this Indian intellectual tradition, and with the dedication that he has. I can see the dedication that he had to learn the Western tradition. He has a much more dedication to learn the Eastern tradition. And therefore, he is one of the interlocutors between two traditions. something that we need to have today. And if Shailja, as you are spending so much of energy in bringing everybody together, if you promise to continue this kind of evenings for us, we will be really grateful to you. Thank you.
So always, in fact, we're thankful to the forum and the group for encouraging young minds. And also, before I end, of all the participants that stayed back, thank you very much. It has been a long session, and if like for us to keep you updated about the upcoming events, you could just quickly drop your email ID in the chat box. And thank you, everybody.
And I can also see Shashank in the meeting. You can also include him as one of the persons who should present a paper. He has done a wonderful work on religion and politics in Gorakhpur.
Okay.
And it's like kind of philosophy and politics interface. And his book is coming from Routledge. So you can also request him to be part of this series.
Sure, sir.
Okay.
I will do it quite soon.
Shashankji, you can get in touch with me. If you could just kindly drop your mail ID at the chat box, I'll get in touch with you. And thank you, Atman. I'll also get in touch with you. So thank you, everybody. We would now like to conclude our session, and I'll stop the recording. So have a good evening and see you soon with one of our discussants as the speaker now, as the trend continues. And thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Shailja.
Thank you, sir.
Professor Thakur. Thank you, Shailja. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
so
Nitin, sir.
much.
Thank you. Thank you.